The boot prints appeared on a Monday. Emmett Holloway found them in the soft dirt between the barn door and the hay storage, a set of small tracks that didn't belong to him and didn't belong to anyone he knew. They were narrow, shallow, the kind of prints made by someone who doesn't weigh much and is trying not to be heard. They led from the barn door to the ladder that went up to the hayloft, and then they stopped, because you can't leave prints on a wooden ladder. He looked at them for a long time. He was a man who noticed things because he lived alone. And when you live alone on a Wyoming cattle ranch, the things you notice are the only conversation you get. He noticed the size first. Small, a child's foot or a small woman's. He noticed the spacing, close together, careful steps, someone walking slowly, placing each foot with intention, which is how a person walks when they don't want to be heard. And he noticed the direction, in but not out. Whoever had come into the barn had not left through the same door. He checked the hayloft. Nothing, just hay and dust and the smell of dried grass, and the light coming through the gaps in the boards the way it always did. If someone had been up there, they were gone now, out through the loft door that opened to the back of the barn and dropped 6 feet to a pile of straw. He kept meaning to move. He thought about it all day while he worked. He mended the fence along the south pasture and thought about the boot prints. He fed the horses and thought about the boot prints. He sat on the porch in the evening with a cup of coffee and looked at the barn and thought about who would walk into a man's barn in the middle of the night and climb up into the hayloft and then leave before dawn. The prints were there again on Tuesday. Same size, same spacing, same careful placement. And this time he noticed something else. 2 eggs were missing from the chicken box inside the barn. He counted every morning because the hens laid regular and he sold the extras in town. And he was too short, and the chickens hadn't eaten them because there were no shells. On Wednesday, the prints were there again, and the milk pail he left under the cow had been moved. Not much, an inch to the left, but Emmett Holloway was a man who put things in the same place every time because order was the scaffolding that held his life together since Sarah died, and an inch was enough to tell him someone had used it. He didn't set a trap. A different man might have. A different man might have put a lock on the barn or sat inside with a lantern or gone to the sheriff in Bridger and reported a trespasser. But Emmett was not a different man. He was a man who had been alone for 4 years and who recognized in the boot prints something he hadn't expected to recognize: care. Whoever was coming into his barn was being careful. They were taking 2 eggs, not a dozen. They were using the milk pail and putting it back. They were climbing into the hayloft and sleeping there and leaving before dawn and sweeping the ladder rungs with their sleeve to hide the marks. This was not a thief. This was someone surviving. He waited until Thursday night. He ate supper early and cleaned the dishes and hung the dish towel on the hook where Sarah used to hang it, and walked out to the barn at sunset the way he always did, to check the horses and lock the feed room. But instead of going back to the house, he climbed the ladder to the hayloft and settled himself in the corner behind the hay bales, where the shadows were deepest, and he could see the loft door and the ladder both. He pulled his coat around himself because the Wyoming nights were cold, even in June, and he waited. He had been a patient man before Sarah died. He was more patient now because patience was the only thing that grief hadn't taken from him. He sat in the dark hayloft and listened to the barn sounds, the horses shifting in their stalls, the cow breathing, a mouse running along the wall beam, the wind pressing against the boards the way it pressed against everything in Wyoming, steady and constant and without apology. The boy came at midnight. He came through the loft door, not the barn door, which explained why the prints only went in one direction. He pulled himself up from the straw pile outside and slipped through the opening without making a sound. And then he stood still for a full minute, listening, the way an animal listens before it enters a space it doesn't trust. Emmett could see his outline in the moonlight that came through the cracks in the boards. Small, thin, no coat, bare feet on the boards, even though the night was cold enough to see your breath. The boy moved to a spot in the hay about 10 feet from where Emmett was sitting. He burrowed into it the way a dog burrows into a blanket, pulling the loose hay over himself for warmth, and within 5 minutes, his breathing changed to the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He had done this before, many times. The hay was shaped around him in a hollow he had worn, with his body over what must have been weeks. Emmett sat in the dark and watched a child sleep in his barn and felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years. He felt the sharp, hot crack in his chest that meant the wall he had built between himself and everything that could hurt him had just developed a fracture. Sarah had wanted children. They had tried for 12 years and it hadn't happened. And then the typhus came and took her and took the possibility with her. And Emmett had boarded up that room in his heart the way you board up a room in a house you can't afford to heat. Now there was a boy sleeping in his hay. He didn't wake him. He sat there until dawn, and when the sky started to lighten and the boy stirred and burrowed out of the hay and slipped back through the loft door, Emmett watched him go and said nothing. He climbed down from the hayloft and went to the house and made coffee and sat on the porch and drank it and looked at the barn and thought about what he was going to do. He left food. That evening he put a plate on the workbench inside the barn. Cold biscuits, a piece of salt pork, a boiled egg. He put a blanket next to it, folded, with a pair of wool socks on top. Then he went to the house and sat on the porch and waited. In the morning, the plate was empty. The blanket was gone. The socks were gone. And in the dirt by the workbench, there was a mark that hadn't been there before. A handprint, small, pressed into the dust beside the plate as if the boy had leaned on the bench to reach the food and left the print by accident. Or maybe not by accident. Maybe a handprint was the only thank you he knew how to give. Emmett left food every night for a week, biscuits and meat and whatever was left from supper. Each morning the plate was clean and the barn was quiet and the boot prints led in through the door and up the ladder, and the boy was gone before dawn. They had a routine now, the rancher and the ghost in his barn, and the routine was built on the understanding that they would not see each other, because seeing each other would require words, and words would require explanations, and explanations would require trust, and trust was something neither of them had in supply. On the second Monday, Dutch Carvel rode up to the ranch. Emmett saw him coming from the south pasture, a stocky man on a bay horse with a loud voice that carried across the valley like a bell. Dutch worked for the mining company in the Bighorn Basin, and he came through the Wind River Valley every few weeks looking for runaway breaker boys, children who had escaped the coal camps and scattered into the rangeland like seeds from a broken pod. Morning Holloway lost a boy about 3 weeks ago from the No. 6 mine. 12 years old, dark hair, thin as a rail. You seen anything? No. You sure? These boys run like rabbits. They hide in barns, root cellars, anywhere they can get out of the wind. The company's got papers on him, legal contract. His father signed him over before he died. Boy's property of the mine until he's 16. Emmett looked at Dutch Carvel sitting on his horse in the morning sun, a man who hunted children the way other men hunted coyotes, with patience and without remorse. He thought about the boot prints. He thought about the handprint in the dust by the plate. "Haven't seen anyone," Emmett said. Dutch nodded and rode on, and Emmett stood in the yard and watched him go, and felt the fracture in his chest widen another inch. That night he didn't leave food on the workbench. He sat in the barn on a hay bale next to the workbench, with a lantern turned low and a plate of food beside him, and waited. The boy came through the loft door at midnight and froze when he saw the light. Emmett could see him now, not just an outline but a face, thin, dirty, dark hair hanging past his ears in mats, eyes wide and dark and old, in a way that no 12-year-old's eyes should be old. He was wearing a man's shirt that hung to his knees, and trousers held up with twine, and no shoes. His feet were black with dirt and cut in places that had scabbed over and cut again. They looked at each other across the barn in the low lantern light. The horses shifted. The cow breathed. The wind pressed against the boards. "There's food," Emmett said. "Sit down." The boy didn't move. He stood by the loft opening like a bird on a fence, ready to drop and fly at the first wrong sound. His hands were shaking, but Emmett couldn't tell if it was fear or cold or both. "My name is Emmett. I own this ranch. I've known you were here for a week. If I was going to hurt you or hand you over, I'd have done it already." The boy came down, slowly, one rung at a time on the ladder, his eyes never leaving Emmett, his body coiled with the readiness of someone who has learned that kindness is usually a trap. He reached the barn floor and stood 6 feet from the workbench and looked at the food. "What's your name?" Emmett asked. "Jesse." "Where'd you come from, Jesse?" "Number 6 mine, Bighorn Basin." "How long were you there?" 2 years. Since my pa died." Emmett pushed the plate toward him. Jesse sat on the edge of the workbench and ate the way hungry children eat, fast and silent, his eyes moving between the food and the door, and the man sitting 3 feet away. He ate everything. He drank the water from the tin cup. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at Emmett and waited for whatever came next, because in his experience, something always came next, and it was never good. "A man came by today looking for you," Emmett said. Jesse's whole body went rigid. His hands gripped the edge of the workbench and his feet found the floor, and he was ready to run, ready to drop through the loft door and vanish into the Wyoming night the way he had vanished from the mine. "I told him I hadn't seen anyone." Jesse stared at him. The lantern threw shadows across his face and made his eyes look even older than they were. He didn't say thank you because he didn't know if it was safe to say thank you yet. He just stared and waited for the rest. "You can stay in the hayloft as long as you need, but you're eating at the table from now on, not out here in the barn like an animal." The boy slept in the hayloft that night and the next night and the night after that, but he ate supper at the kitchen table with Emmett every evening, sitting in the chair that had been Sarah's, eating with a fork and a knife on a plate with a pattern on it, the way a person eats when they are inside a house instead of hiding in a barn. He didn't talk much at first. He ate and watched Emmett the way a stray watches the person who feeds it, grateful and suspicious in equal measure, waiting for the moment when the hand that gives becomes the hand that takes. But the moment didn't come. Emmett fed him and gave him clothes that were still too big, but better than what he had, and gave him boots that he stuffed with newspaper until his feet grew into them, and showed him how to mend a fence and shoe a horse and milk a cow properly, instead of stealing from the pail in the dark. He didn't ask Jesse about the mine. He didn't ask about his father. He didn't ask because he understood that some stories need time to climb out of the hole they've been living in, and pushing them makes them dig deeper. Jesse told him anyway. It came out in pieces over 3 weeks, arriving without warning. His father had been a miner who died in a collapse. The company had taken Jesse as a breaker boy to work off his father's debt, 14-hour days sorting coal that tore the skin off his fingers and filled his lungs with black dust. He had run when the night guard fell asleep and walked 30 miles west because the sun looked free when it went down, and he wanted to go where it went. Emmett listened and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would fix what had been done to the boy. You can't fix 2 years in a coal mine with words. You can only fix it with time and food and a chair at a table and the slow, steady proof that not every hand in the world is a fist. Dutch Carvel came back 3 weeks later. Emmett saw him from the porch and told Jesse to go to the root cellar and stay quiet. Jesse went without a word because he had been hiding from men like Dutch his whole life, and he knew the drill, the way a rabbit knows a hawk's shadow. Holloway, that boy's still missing. Company's offering $10 for his return. You sure you haven't seen him? I told you last time, haven't seen anyone. Dutch looked at the barn. He looked at the house. He looked at Emmett standing on the porch with his arms folded and his face set in the expression of a man who has nothing to hide because the thing he is hiding is in the root cellar and the root cellar doors covered with a rug. Mind if I check the barn? I do mind. This is my property, and you don't have a warrant, and the last time I checked, a ranch foreman doesn't have the authority to search a man's barn in Wyoming territory. Dutch sat on his horse and stared at Emmett for a long time. Then he turned and rode south, and Emmett watched him go and knew he would be back, probably with the sheriff, probably with papers. And when he came back, the root cellar wouldn't be enough. He rode to Bridger that afternoon. He tied his horse outside the general store and went in and found Ada Whitfield behind the counter, sorting bolts of fabric with the careful attention of a woman who arranges the world into order because the world refuses to arrange itself. I need help, Emmett said. He told her about the boy, the mine, the boot prints, Dutch Carvel, and the papers that said a 12-year-old was property of a coal company. Ada listened with her hands still and her eyes sharp behind the wire spectacles. She had lost her own son to a mine cave-in 6 years ago, and the loss had turned her into something harder and clearer. There's an orphan train through Cheyenne the first week of every month, she said. Places children with families back east. If the boy can get there by the 5th, the mining company can't touch him. Cheyenne is 150 miles. I know a woman who drives a freight wagon from Bridger to Cheyenne every 2 weeks. The boy rides in the back under the canvas. Emmett rode home and told Jesse. He sat the boy down at the kitchen table and told him about Cheyenne and the orphan train and the life that was waiting for him at the end of 150 miles of wagon road. Jesse looked at the plate in front of him, the one with the pattern on it. He looked at the chair he was sitting in. He looked at the kitchen and the stove and the dish towel on the hook. I don't want to go east, Jesse said. Jesse, I want to stay here. Emmett looked at the boy across the table, 12 years old, dark eyes too old for his face, hands healing from the coal dust, the fingers learning to hold a hammer and a bridle instead of chunks of black rock. Dutch will come back, Emmett said. He'll bring the sheriff. They'll take you. Then don't let 'em. Emmett sat in the kitchen for a long time after Jesse went out to do the evening chores. He looked at the empty chair and the plate with the pattern and the dish towel on the hook, and he thought about Sarah, who had wanted a child so badly that the wanting had become the weather of their marriage. Always present, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, but never gone. He rode to Bridger the next morning, but he didn't go to the freight wagon. He went to the territorial judge's office and filed papers to adopt Jesse as his legal son. The judge was an old man who had seen every kind of case the frontier could produce, and who looked at Emmett over his spectacles and asked if he understood what he was doing. I'm keeping a boy. The mining company will contest it. Let 'em. A contract signed by a dead man over a child's labor isn't adoption, it's indenture. And the last time I checked, indenture of minors is illegal in Wyoming territory. The judge looked at him for a long time. Then he stamped the papers and handed them across the desk and said, "Good luck, Holloway." Dutch Carvel came back one more time, 3 weeks later, with the sheriff. Emmett met them on the porch with the adoption papers in his hand, and Jesse standing behind him in the doorway, wearing boots that fit now, and a shirt that was only one size too big, and the expression of a boy who has found the thing he was walking toward when he followed the sunset west. The sheriff read the papers. Dutch read the papers. The mining company sent a letter. The territorial judge sent a letter back. And somewhere in the exchange of paper and ink and legal language, a 12-year-old boy stopped being property and started being a person, which is all he had ever been. But the world had needed a piece of paper to agree. Jesse slept in the hayloft for 2 more weeks after that, not because he had to, but because the hay still smelled like the first place he had ever felt safe. And safety is a scent the body remembers long after the fear is gone. Then, one evening, Emmett opened the door to the small room at the end of the hall, the room that had been meant for the child Sarah never had, and he said, "This is yours." Jesse stood in the doorway and looked at the room. A bed with a quilt, a window that faced the mountains, a hook on the wall for his coat, a shelf for his boots. It was not much. It was everything. He moved in that night. And in the morning, Emmett found boot prints in the soft dirt between the house and the barn, small and steady and heading out to start the chores. And for the first time in 4 years, the sight of footprints on his property made him feel something other than alone. The Wind River Range caught the morning light and held it. The valley spread green and wide between the mountains, and in a ranch house at the end of a dirt road in Wyoming territory, a man who had been empty and a boy who had been lost sat down at a table with a pattern on the plates and ate breakfast together, and neither one of them said anything, because the best mornings don't need words. They just need someone sitting in the other chair.